In September of 1327, inside a small stone chamber at Berkeley Castle, a deposed king died screaming. The official record claims natural causes. Witnesses spoke of something far worse. For 900 years, one family has lived behind these walls, their bloodline unbroken, their grip on this fortress absolute. They survived the murder of a monarch. They weathered civil wars that toppled dynasties. They outlasted empires. But survival came at a price measured in compromise, complicity, and blood. This is not a story about nobility. This is the story of what a family will do to keep what they believe is theirs. Chapter 1. The Fortress Built on Stolen Ground. Roger de Berkeley seized these lands in 1066 with nothing but a Norman sword and William's favor. He arrived in Gloucestershire 3 months after Hastings, when Saxon blood still stained the autumn fields and resistance meant death. The land he claimed had belonged to Earl Godwin's family for generations. Their stone manor still stood. Their cattle still grazed the water meadows along the Severn. Roger burned the manor and built a wooden keep where the ashes settled. This was conquest, not inheritance. William the Conqueror distributed England like a merchant dividing inventory. Loyalty earned land. Roger de Berkeley had fought at Hastings. He had killed for William. The reward was 12,000 acres of Gloucestershire, carved from the heart of Saxon England, and granted to a man whose grandfather had never crossed the Channel. By 1090, the wooden keep had become stone. Roger understood what the Saxons before him had learned through blood and fire. Land without fortification is just geography. But land with walls, with towers, with a keep that commands the valley, that land becomes power. Berkeley Castle rose on a limestone outcrop between Bristol and Gloucester, controlling the Severn crossing and the trade routes that fed the Welsh marches. Every merchant, every army, every message between London and the western frontier passed within sight of these walls. The castle Roger built was not beautiful. Beauty implied leisure. It was a weapon disguised as architecture. The keep walls measured 14 feet thick at the base. The Great Hall could garrison 60 soldiers. The dungeons were built first, before the chapel, because controlling people mattered more than saving their souls. Roger died in 1131, 50 miles from Berkeley, on a visit to another estate he barely remembered acquiring. He was buried in a church he had never attended. His son inherited everything. That son, also Roger, learned the essential truth of Norman aristocracy. Inheritance is theft rendered legal by time. The second Roger expanded the castle. He added a curtain wall, a second tower, and fortified the gatehouse with a portcullis heavy enough to crush a mounted knight. By 1154, Berkeley Castle had become more than a fortress. It had become a statement. The Berkeleys were not visitors. They were not temporary occupants holding land until the Saxons returned. They were the new reality, as permanent as stone, as immovable as the limestone beneath their foundations. The family developed a sigil, a chevron between 10 crosses. The crosses represented piety. The chevron represented ambition. Together, they represented a family that understood survival required both the appearance of godliness and the willingness to act without mercy when necessary. What makes someone believe they deserve to rule land their grandfather never saw? The Berkeleys never asked that question. They simply outlasted anyone who might have demanded an answer. Within 3 generations, Saxon memory faded. The land became Berkeley land, not because of ancient right, but because no one remained alive with the strength to take it back. That is how inheritance works. Blood becomes soil, soil becomes title, title becomes truth. Chapter 2. The Castle that demanded loyalty. By 1154, Berkeley Castle had become the most strategic fortress between Bristol and Gloucester, which meant it became deadly. Geography is destiny in medieval England. The castle sat at the intersection of ambition and violence, where loyalty was measured in how quickly you chose sides when armies approached your walls. King Stephen died that year after 19 years of civil war that historians would call the Anarchy. Henry II took the throne, 21 years old, and determined to break every baron who had grown too powerful during the chaos. The Berkeleys owned a fortress that could bottle up the Severn Valley. Henry noticed. Robert de Berkeley, grandson of the Conqueror, received a royal summons in 1155. The message was courteous. The threat was absolute. Come to court and swear fealty, or watch your castle burn. Robert went to Westminster. He knelt before a king young enough to be his son. He placed his hands between Henry's hands and spoke the oath that every Norman lord had memorized. I become your man for the lands I hold of you. The oath bound him. Break it, and Henry could seize Berkeley Castle legally, with the blessing of every other lord who had sworn the same words. Robert returned home understanding that ownership was conditional. The king owned England. The Berkeleys merely held Berkeley Castle in trust, and trust could be revoked. Henry tested that trust in 1163. He needed Berkeley Castle as a staging ground for his campaign into Wales. Robert opened his gates, provisioned 600 soldiers, and watched royal troops turn his great hall into a barracks for 3 months. They consumed 2 years' worth of stored grain. They slaughtered cattle faster than the estate could replace them. When Henry's army marched west, they left Berkeley Castle stripped bare, and Robert 10,000 pounds poorer. Robert never protested. He smiled. He bowed. He wrote letters expressing his honor at serving the crown, because he understood the game. Protest meant disloyalty. Disloyalty meant forfeiture. Better to be impoverished and landed than wealthy and dispossessed. The castle demanded this flexibility. Its location made neutrality impossible. Every civil war, every baronial rebellion, every succession crisis forced the Berkeleys to choose. Support the king and risk baronial revenge. Support the barons and risk royal retribution. The family developed a survival instinct refined over generations: commit late, switch early, and always retain deniability. In 1173, Henry's own sons rebelled. Robert de Berkeley publicly supported the king while privately allowing rebel messengers to use Berkeley Castle as a way station. When the rebellion collapsed, Robert provided evidence of the messengers' routes, implicating other barons. Henry rewarded him with additional lands. The other barons remembered the betrayal. Robert didn't care. They were dead, dispossessed. He was still Lord of Berkeley. This became the family strategy. Absolute loyalty to whoever held power. Absolute ruthlessness toward whoever lost it. The castle itself seemed to encourage this moral flexibility. Its walls had no memory. Its dungeons held both royal prisoners and rebel lords depending on the season. The building demanded pragmatism. Idealism was a luxury for families with less to lose. Robert died in 1178, wealthy despite Henry's exploitation, secure despite 30 years of choosing sides in conflicts where choosing wrong meant annihilation. His son inherited the castle and the lesson encoded in its stones. loyalty is a tool, not a virtue. Geography had made the Berkeleys important. Flexibility would keep them alive. Chapter 3. When a king became a prisoner. On April 16, 1327, soldiers delivered Edward II to Berkeley Castle in chains, and Thomas de Berkeley knew his bloodline would never be clean again. The man they dragged through the gatehouse had been King of England for 20 years. He had commanded armies. He had signed treaties that reshaped Europe. 3 months earlier, men had knelt when he entered a room. Now he stumbled, filthy and broken, pushed by guards who handled him like livestock. Thomas watched from the keep window. He was 35 years old. He had inherited Berkeley Castle 5 years earlier. Nothing in those 5 years had prepared him for this. Queen Isabella had signed the order herself. Roger Mortimer, her lover, and the true power behind her coup, had countersigned it. Edward II was to be held at Berkeley Castle indefinitely, under the custody of Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, until further notice. The document used careful language: protective custody, humane treatment, the king's safety ensured. But Thomas could read subtext. They had given him a deposed monarch, too dangerous to free and too valuable to kill quickly. Edward was 40, 3 years old. He had been king since 1307. His reign had been chaos. He had lost wars in Scotland. He had elevated male favorites to positions that enraged the nobility. He had bankrupted the treasury on construction projects and gifts to men he loved more than his kingdom. The barons had forced him to execute his closest companion, Piers Gaveston, in 1312. Edward never forgave them. England spent the next 15 years locked in a cold civil war between a king who refused to rule wisely and nobles who refused to submit. Isabella had broken the deadlock by taking a lover with an army. Mortimer invaded England in September 1326 with mercenaries funded by French gold. The kingdom collapsed in 3 months. Edward's support evaporated. His own son, 15-year-old Edward III, became the figurehead of his mother's coup. In January 1327, Parliament declared Edward II unfit to rule. They forced him to abdicate in favor of his son. The official reason: incompetence, not treason; deposition, not execution. This legal fiction kept everyone's hands technically clean. But deposing a king creates a permanent problem. As long as Edward lived, he remained a rallying point for rebellion. Loyalists could claim the abdication was invalid. They could argue that Edward III was a puppet controlled by his mother and her lover. The solution was obvious to everyone who understood medieval politics. Edward II had to die. But it had to appear natural. Thomas de Berkeley understood all of this as he watched the broken king being led to the chambers in the keep. Edward would live in rooms 30 feet above the Great Hall, comfortable enough to suggest humane treatment, isolated enough to prevent escape. The windows faced the inner courtyard, away from the outer walls. Guards would stand outside the door day and night. Thomas had been promised £40 for Edward's custody. £40. The payment was documented in royal accounts. That documentation would protect him or destroy him, depending on what came next. Edward looked at Thomas once as they locked him in his chamber. The king's eyes were empty. He knew what custody meant. He knew what happened to deposed monarchs. He had read history. Kings who lost their crowns rarely died of old age. Thomas turned away. He had not asked for this, but he had not refused it either. The Queen had ordered. Mortimer had insisted. Refusal would have meant losing Berkeley Castle, possibly losing his life. So Thomas had agreed. He had signed the documents. He had accepted the payment. He had become the jailer to a king. The trap had closed. Edward was imprisoned. Thomas was complicit. And somewhere in London, Isabella and Mortimer were waiting for news that the problem had resolved itself. The 40 pounds sat in Thomas's treasury. The king sat in Thomas's keep. And the only question remaining was how long both would remain alive. Dieu, Chapter 4. The Murder No One Could Prove. On September 21st, 1327, Edward II died inside Berkeley Castle, and 3 different accounts emerged within a week. The official record, presented to Parliament on October 15th, stated that the former king had died of natural causes after a sudden illness. He had been melancholic. He had refused food. His health had deteriorated rapidly. Physicians had attended him. Their efforts had failed. The death was unfortunate, but unavoidable. The body was displayed at St. Peter's Abbey in Gloucester. Witnesses confirmed the corpse showed no visible marks of violence. The face was peaceful. The hands were unmarked. The king had simply stopped living. The second account came from servants inside the castle. They spoke quietly in taverns, careful not to name names. They claimed Edward had been smothered in his sleep. Pillows pressed against his face until he stopped breathing. Suffocation leaves no marks. The body appears untouched. In 1327, with no modern forensics, no autopsy protocols, no criminal investigation procedures, suffocation was the perfect murder. Rumor spread through Gloucestershire within days. The king had not died. He had been killed. The third account emerged years later, whispered by chroniclers who claimed sources inside the castle. This version was specific, horrifying, precise. Edward had been held down by multiple men. A funnel had been inserted. A red-hot poker, heated in the great hall fireplace until it glowed, had been thrust through the funnel into his body. The internal injuries would kill him slowly. The burns would be hidden. No external marks meant no proof of murder. The chroniclers claimed the king's screams had been heard throughout the keep, that soldiers had stopped mid-patrol, frozen by sounds no human should make, that Thomas de Berkeley had been absent that night, conveniently away from the castle on business, no records ever confirmed. 3 stories, 1 death, no definitive truth. The forensic reality of medieval England made proof impossible. There were no police investigations, no crime scene analysis, no interrogations under oath. The body was viewed by nobles loyal to Isabella and Mortimer. The physicians who examined Edward were appointed by the same regime that had deposed him. The official cause of death was determined by people whose power depended on Edward staying dead. Objective investigation did not exist. Political convenience determined truth. The financial records, however, tell a story the Berkeleys could not control. Royal accounts from 1327 show Thomas de Berkeley received exactly 40 pounds for Edward's custody, paid in 2 installments of 20 pounds each. The first payment came in April when Edward arrived. The second came in August, 1 month before Edward died. No third payment appeared, no additional compensation for extended custody, no reward for successfully maintaining the king's imprisonment beyond September. This absence is revealing. Medieval accounting was precise about ongoing obligations. If Edward was supposed to remain at Berkeley indefinitely, payments would continue. The fact that payments stopped in August suggests someone knew custody would end in September. Someone had planned a terminal date. The money trail points toward premeditation. More damning, Thomas de Berkeley's presence at court. Records show he attended royal councils regularly from April through early September 1327. He appeared at Westminster in July. He witnessed royal charters in August. Then, for 2 weeks in mid-September, he vanished from all official records. No charters bear his seal. No councils record his attendance. He reappeared in early October, days after Edward's death was announced. His whereabouts during those crucial 2 weeks remain unconfirmed. Medieval lords did not disappear accidentally. Their movements were documented by household accounts, travel expenses, and witness testimony. Thomas de Berkeley's absence during the exact period Edward died suggests calculated deniability. He was not at Berkeley Castle when the king expired. Therefore, he could not have ordered the death. Therefore, he bore no legal responsibility. The logic was flawless. The coincidence was absurd. John Maltravers, Thomas's co-jailer, also vanished from records in September 1327. He reappeared in 1328, significantly wealthier, with new lands granted by Queen Isabella. The reward suggests service. The timing suggests what that service entailed. Edward's body was embalmed immediately after death. Unusual for a deposed monarch, but standard for murder, victims needing preservation before investigation. The embalming process destroyed any internal evidence of poker insertion or suffocation. Whether this was deliberate or coincidental remains unknowable. The effect was absolute. Physical proof of murder became impossible. The body was displayed for 2 days at Berkeley Castle before being transported to Gloucester. Contemporary accounts describe the corpse as remarkably preserved, with no sign of corruption. For a man dead in September heat, this level of preservation suggests embalming happened within hours of death. Someone had been prepared. Someone had planned for public display. Someone knew that credibility required a viewable corpse that contradicted murder rumors. 3 months after Edward's death, Parliament formally recognized Edward III as rightful king and closed all inquiries into his father's demise. The official verdict: natural death by divine providence. The unofficial understanding: necessary elimination of a political threat. The truth: unknowable, unverifiable, and carefully designed to remain that way. Thomas de Berkeley kept his castle, he kept his title, he kept his 40 pounds, and he kept his silence. Whatever happened in that chamber on September 21st, 1327, died with Edward. The only certainty is that a king entered Berkeley Castle alive and left dead, and the family who held the keys prospered afterward. Everything else is speculation built on rumor, recorded by chroniclers with agendas, filtered through 9 centuries of legendary embellishment. But the screams, if they existed, are said to echo still. Chapter 5: The Trial That Saved a Dynasty. In 1330, Thomas de Berkeley stood trial for regicide and walked free on a technicality that still stinks of bribery. The trial happened because Roger Mortimer fell. For 3 years after Edward II's death, Mortimer ruled England through Isabella and the teenage Edward III. He accumulated titles. He seized estates. He governed like a king without the crown. But in October 1330, Edward III turned 18 and decided he was done being a puppet. He arrested Mortimer at Nottingham Castle, charged him with treason, and had him executed at Tyburn in November. The entire coup regime collapsed in 3 weeks. With Mortimer dead, Edward III needed someone to blame for his father's murder. The official story, natural causes, satisfied no one. The rumors, suffocation, and worse, demanded accountability. But accusing his mother, Queen Isabella, meant destroying the legitimacy of his own reign. If Isabella had murdered Edward II, then Edward III had inherited the throne through matricide and treason. That truth could not be acknowledged without toppling the entire Plantagenet dynasty. So Edward needed a different villain. Someone close enough to the murder to be plausible. Someone expendable enough to prosecute without political consequences. Someone whose conviction would satisfy public demands for justice without implicating the royal family. Thomas de Berkeley was perfect. Parliament convened the inquiry in April 1330. The charges were specific. Thomas de Berkeley, Lord of Berkeley Castle, had conspired with Roger Mortimer and John Maltravers to murder Edward II while the former king was held in his custody. Evidence included witness testimony from castle servants, financial records showing the £40 payment, and the convenient fact that Thomas had been Mortimer's ally throughout the coup. Thomas appeared before Parliament in chains. He was 40 years old. He had spent 3 years watching Mortimer's regime grow increasingly tyrannical, knowing that proximity to power meant complicity in its crimes. Now Mortimer was dead, and Thomas was the designated scapegoat. If convicted of regicide, he would be executed. His lands would be forfeited. The Berkeley bloodline would end. Everything his family had held for 260 years would vanish because he had agreed to hold a king. His defense was simple. He had not been present when Edward died. He had left Berkeley Castle in early September on estate business. John Maltravers had held sole custody during the crucial period. Thomas had only learned of the king's death upon his return. Therefore, he bore no responsibility for whatever had transpired in his absence. Parliament demanded proof. Thomas provided none. No household accounts documented his departure. No witnesses testified to his presence elsewhere. No letters confirmed estate business requiring his attention. His entire defense rested on absence of evidence, not evidence of absence. He claimed he was not there. He could not prove he was elsewhere. In modern courts, this would be laughable. In 1330, it was sufficient. The reason becomes clear in the trial structure. The prosecution called witnesses who testified to screams from the king's chamber. They described unusual activity in the keep. They noted the sudden presence of unfamiliar soldiers in mid-September. But when asked to identify who had given orders, who had been present, who had coordinated the alleged murder, the witnesses became vague. They could not name names. They could not provide dates. Their testimony established that something had happened, but not who had done it. John Maltravers, the obvious villain, had fled England in late 1329. He was in France, beyond Parliament's jurisdiction. Conveniently, his absence meant he could not testify against Thomas or implicate higher powers. Mortimer, who could have revealed the entire conspiracy, was dead. Isabella, who had almost certainly ordered the murder, was the king's mother and immune from prosecution. The only person available to punish was Thomas de Berkeley, and punishing him required proof that his own defense made impossible. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On May 2nd, 1330, Parliament delivered its verdict. Thomas de Berkeley was found not guilty by reason of absence. The judgment acknowledged that murder had likely occurred. It noted that Thomas had profited from Edward's custody. It observed that suspicious circumstances surrounded the death. But it concluded that without evidence placing Thomas physically present at the murder, conviction was legally impossible. Thomas walked free. He returned to Berkeley Castle. He resumed his position as Lord of Gloucestershire. No fines were levied. No lands were confiscated. His title remained intact. The only cost was 3 weeks in chains and the permanent stain of suspicion that no verdict could wash clean. The political calculation was obvious. Edward III needed someone blamed for the murder, but he did not need someone punished. Blame established that a crime had occurred, satisfying public outrage, but punishment would require revealing who had ordered the crime, which led directly to Isabella. By finding Thomas technically not guilty while morally suspect, Parliament achieved the impossible. They acknowledged regicide without implicating the regime. They punished the appearance of guilt without proving actual guilt. They made Thomas de Berkeley the official answer to who killed Edward II, while simultaneously declaring him legally innocent. This legal gymnastics served everyone's interest except truth. Edward III avoided accusing his mother. Parliament avoided investigating a murder commissioned by the previous government. Thomas avoided execution. Isabella avoided trial. The only loser was historical clarity. What actually happened in September 1327 became permanently unknowable, buried under layers of political expediency and legal technicality. Thomas understood what the verdict meant. He was free, but not forgiven. Innocent legally, but guilty historically. He could keep Berkeley Castle, but he would spend the rest of his life explaining why a king had died in his custody while he was conveniently absent. The trial saved his life. It could not save his reputation. Within a year, Thomas began donations to churches and monasteries throughout Gloucestershire. He funded masses for Edward II's soul. He endowed chantries to pray for the dead king's salvation. Guilt or political calculation, the effect was identical. He spent decades trying to buy absolution for a crime he claimed he never committed. The fact that he felt the need suggests what the verdict could not prove. Thomas de Berkeley knew exactly what had happened in that chamber. He simply had the wisdom to be elsewhere when it occurred. Chapter 6: The Blood Price of Innocence. Berkeley kept his castle, but Edward III never forgot, and forgiveness is not the same as trust. The verdict in 1330 cleared Thomas de Berkeley legally. Politically, it marked the beginning of 30 years in purgatory. Edward III could not punish Thomas without implicating his mother, but he did not have to reward him either. Trust, once broken, cannot be restored by parliamentary acquittal. For the rest of his reign, Edward treated the Berkeley family with cold calculation. They thoughts were useful, they were landed, they were too powerful to destroy without cause, but they would never again hold positions of genuine royal confidence. The punishment came through exclusion. Thomas de Berkeley had attended court regularly before Edward II's death. Afterward, royal summons became rare. He was invited to Parliament when attendance was mandatory. He was excluded from royal councils where actual policy was made. His advice went unasked. His presence went unrequired. Other lords received military commands, diplomatic missions, appointments to lucrative posts managing royal estates. Thomas received nothing. The financial cost was immediate. Medieval power required royal favor. Favor meant grants of additional lands, wardships of wealthy minors, licenses to hold markets and levy tolls. Without favor, a lord's income stagnated. Thomas watched his peers grow wealthier through royal patronage, while Berkeley Castle's revenue remained fixed. By 1340, he was significantly poorer than barons with half his landholdings, simply because Edward's generosity flowed elsewhere. Then came the fees disguised as fines. In 1345, Edward demanded a relief payment of £500 for Thomas's continued tenure of Berkeley lands. Relief payments were traditional when land changed hands through inheritance, but Thomas had inherited Berkeley in 1321. The demand, 24 years after inheritance, was legally questionable. Thomas paid without protest. Protest meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant someone might ask again about September 1327. In 1348, Edward required a loan of £1,000 to fund the French campaigns. The loan was technically voluntary. Refusal was technically possible. In practice, saying no to a king who suspected you of murdering his father was suicidal. Thomas borrowed against his estates to raise the funds. The loan was never repaid. Edward's records listed it as a gift, not a debt. Thomas lost £1,000 and gained nothing but the king's continued tolerance. The hostages came next. In 1352, Edward requested that Thomas's eldest son, Maurice, join the royal household as a page. The request was phrased as an honor. The reality was transparent. Maurice de Berkeley, age 14, heir to Berkeley Castle, would live at court where Edward could watch him. The message was clear: behave, or your bloodline suffers. Thomas sent his son. Maurice spent 6 years at court, learning that proximity to power meant permanent surveillance. He returned to Berkeley in 1358, trained in loyalty and fear. Throughout these decades, Thomas maintained perfect outward submission. He attended Parliament when summoned. He provided soldiers when requested. He paid taxes without complaint. His public demeanor suggested a man grateful for royal mercy. His private accounts tell a different story. Between 1330 and 1360, Berkeley Castle's expenditures on royal fees, loans, and payments exceeded £12,000. For comparison, the entire estate generated approximately £800 annual income. Thomas spent 15 years' worth of revenue buying Edward's continued forbearance. The social cost exceeded the financial burden. Aristocratic society operates on trust networks. Lords who married their daughters to each other's sons, who invested in joint ventures, who supported each other's claims at court. Thomas found himself excluded from these networks. Other barons remembered the trial. They remembered the rumors. Their daughters did not marry Berkeley's sons. Their sons did not enter Berkeley's service. Social isolation became another price of legal innocence. Thomas tried to rebuild his reputation through religious patronage. He funded the rebuilding of St. Augustine's Abbey in Bristol. He endowed perpetual masses at Berkeley Church. He donated lands to monasteries throughout Gloucestershire. Between 1335 and 1360, he gave away nearly £2,000 in religious gifts, buying prayers for Edward II's soul and his own salvation. The gifts were genuine acts of faith. They were also calculated reputation management. A man who funded masses for a murdered king appeared pious, not complicit. None of it fully worked. The stain remained. In 1360, when Thomas negotiated the marriage of his granddaughter to a minor baron, the marriage contract included a clause requiring the groom's family to never publicly question the circumstances of Edward II's death. The need for such a clause, 33 years after the event, reveals how thoroughly the murder had become the family's defining characteristic. They were not the Berkeleys who held Gloucestershire for 3 centuries. They were the Berkeleys in whose castle a king died screaming. Thomas de Berkeley died on October 13, 1361. He was 70 years old. He had been Lord of Berkeley for 45 years. He had survived a regicide trial, 3 decades of royal suspicion, financial exploitation disguised as fees, and permanent social stigma. He had kept Berkeley Castle. He had preserved the family title. He had maintained the bloodline through 2 generations. By the ruthless metric of aristocratic survival, he had succeeded. But the cost was total. He died significantly poorer than he had inherited. His family's reputation was permanently compromised. His grandson would grow up explaining that great-grandfather was not technically guilty of murder, just conveniently absent when it happened. And every Berkeley heir after him would live inside rooms where Edward II had spent his final months. The crime scene become family home. Thomas was buried at Berkeley Church, beside 3 generations of ancestors who had built the family fortune through conquest and political skill. His tomb includes no mention of Edward II, no reference to the trial, no acknowledgement of the 40 pounds or the 30 years purgatory. The epitaph describes a pious lord who served his king faithfully. History, at least on his tombstone, had been edited. The truth remained in the stones of the castle itself, in the chamber where the king had died, in the walls that had witnessed everything and remembered nothing. Edward III outlived Thomas by 16 years. He never publicly accused the Berkeley family again. He never restored them to favor either. Forgiveness and trust are different things. Thomas had learned that difference through decades of calculated humiliation. His descendants would inherit the lesson along with the land. Chapter 7. When legacy became a weapon. For 200 years after Edward's murder, every Berkeley heir was raised inside rooms where a king had died screaming. The chamber became a teaching tool. Fathers brought sons to the spot, showed them the worn stones, explained what had happened here and why the family had survived it. The lesson was not about guilt or innocence. The lesson was about power. The Berkeleys had held a king. They had become complicit in his death. They had been tried for regicide and walked free. That history, properly understood, was not shame. It was armor. By 1400, the murder legend had calcified into family mythology. The Berkeleys did not deny the rumors. They encouraged them. A family ruthless enough to hold a king, possibly kill a king, and definitely profit from his death was a family no rational enemy would cross. The castle's reputation became a political asset. Lords negotiating with the Berkeleys understood they were dealing with people who had survived the unsurvivable through sheer pragmatic ruthlessness. The Wars of the Roses, beginning in 1455, tested this reputation thoroughly. The conflict between York and Lancaster divided England into armed camps. Choosing sides meant everything. Choosing wrong meant forfeiture and death. The Berkeleys, with 3 centuries of practice in political survival, chose all sides. In 1461, James de Berkeley declared for Lancaster. He provided troops to Queen Margaret's army. He attended Lancastrian councils. When Edward IV, a Yorkist, seized the throne, James immediately switched allegiance. He swore loyalty to Edward within 3 months. The speed suggested pragmatism, not conviction. Edward accepted the oath because executing every lord who had opposed him would leave England ungovernable. In 1470, when Henry VI briefly reclaimed the throne, James switched back to Lancaster. 6 months later, when Edward IV returned, James switched again to York. He attended Edward's coronation ceremony, kneeling before a king whose enemies he had supported twice in 9 years. Edward granted him a pardon. Publicly, the pardon demonstrated royal mercy. Privately, it acknowledged that the Berkeleys were too entrenched, too strategic, and too experienced at survival to punish without significant effort. This flexibility appeared cowardly to contemporaries. Chronicle writers mocked James de Berkeley as a weather-vane lord, turning with every political wind. But James understood what the chroniclers did not. Ideology was a luxury for families with nothing to lose. The Berkeleys had everything to lose. Loyalty to a cause meant potential destruction. Loyalty to survival meant Berkeley Castle remained Berkeley property, regardless of which rose sat on the throne. The family weaponized their reputation for pragmatism. During negotiations, James would remind opponents that Berkeley Castle had held a king once, that its dungeons were deep, that its walls had never been breached, that the family knew how to keep secrets and bury problems. The threats were never explicit. They did not need to be. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone understood the implication. Cross the Berkeleys at your peril. They have survived worse enemies than you. This psychological warfare worked because it was historically grounded. The Berkeleys were not inventing a ruthless reputation. They were inheriting one. Their ancestors had done the unthinkable and faced no lasting consequences. That precedent shaped negotiations. When James de Berkeley suggested a particular political arrangement, opponents understood that refusal might have consequences the law could never prove. The murder of Edward II, 2 centuries old, still cast shadows in 15th century politics. The family's children grew up immersed in this legacy. They played in the great hall where Edward II had been held. They slept in chambers adjacent to the room where he died. The castle itself became a pedagogical environment, teaching each generation that survival required moral flexibility, that honor was negotiable, that land mattered more than loyalty. Maurice de Berkeley, James's son, described the family philosophy in a letter written in 1485. Our fathers held this castle through storms that destroyed greater houses. They bent when they must. They struck when they could. They never forgot that keeping the land was victory enough. The letter was private correspondence, never intended for public view. Its candor reveals how thoroughly the family had internalized ruthlessness as virtue. The psychological cost of living inside a crime scene remains unrecorded. No Berkeley diary discusses guilt. No family letters mention nightmares. But the castle's architecture evolved in telling ways. Beginning in the late 1400s, subsequent lords built new residential wings as far from Edward's chamber as possible. They constructed elaborate private apartments in the South Range, maximizing distance from the keep. The public explanation was modernization and comfort. The private reality might have been simpler. Sleeping where a king died was psychologically untenable after multiple generations. Yet they could not abandon the keep entirely. Its symbolic value was too great. The chamber where Edward died remained furnished, maintained, shown to important visitors as proof of the family's historical significance. The Berkeleys had learned to monetize their darkest moment. They used the murder chamber to demonstrate power, intimidate rivals, and prove their lineage's unbroken continuity. What should have been shame became spectacle. By 1500, the murder legend had acquired supernatural embellishments. Servants reported screams from empty rooms. Guards claimed to see a figure in royal robes wandering the keep at midnight. Whether these stories were genuine belief or encouraged rumor is unknowable. The effect was identical. Berkeley Castle gained a reputation as haunted, cursed, dangerous. The family did nothing to dispel the stories. A haunted castle was harder to besiege than merely a fortified one. The Roses ended in 1485 with Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field. The Berkeleys, who had switched sides 4 times during the conflict, ended the war on the winning side purely through timing. They attended Henry's coronation. They swore loyalty. They received confirmation of their lands and titles. They had survived another dynastic collapse through the same strategy that had worked for 4 centuries. Commit to nothing permanent, adapt to everything inevitable, and never prioritize honor over survival. 200 years after Edward II's death, the Berkeleys had transformed from suspected regicides into professional survivors. The murder that should have destroyed them had become their defining strength. They were the family who could not be destroyed because they had already done the unforgivable and prospered anyway. That reputation, carefully cultivated across 8 generations, made them simultaneously feared and indispensable. They had weaponized their own crime scene. The castle built on stolen Saxon land, the fortress that held a murdered king, had become the family's greatest asset precisely because of the blood soaked into its stones. Chapter 8: The Siege That Should Have Ended Everything. In 1645, parliamentary forces surrounded Berkeley Castle with cannon and orders to burn every Berkeley to ash. The English Civil War had reached Gloucestershire. King Charles I against Parliament, Royalists against Roundheads. The war was partly about governance, partly about religion, entirely about power. The Berkeleys, true to family tradition, tried to stay neutral. Neutrality in civil war is choosing both sides while claiming neither. It works until one side wins decisively. Then neutrality looks like treachery. George de Berkeley, 9th Baron, had attempted careful balance. He paid taxes to Parliament when parliamentary troops controlled Gloucestershire. He provisioned Royalist forces when Royalist armies passed through. He attended neither side's councils. He signed neither side's declarations. He believed that strategic ambiguity would allow Berkeley Castle to survive regardless of who ultimately won. He was half right. The castle would survive. His strategy would not. By 1645, Parliament controlled most of England. Charles I was losing. Royalist strongholds were falling systematically. Parliamentary commanders had orders to seize every fortified position that might serve as a future Royalist base. Berkeley Castle, despite George's neutrality, qualified. Its walls were intact. Its position commanded the Severn. Its dungeons could hold prisoners. Its lord had never explicitly declared for Parliament. That was enough. Colonel Thomas Rainsborough arrived in September with 1,200 men, 8 cannon, and explicit orders. Demand surrender. If refused, bombard the castle until the walls breached. If the Berkeley family resisted, make an example of them. Parliament was done tolerating neutrality disguised as pragmatism. George de Berkeley stood on the battlements watching the army deploy. He was 62 years old. He had been Lord of Berkeley for 30 years without firing a shot in anger. His grandfather had survived the Wars of the Roses through flexibility. His great-grandfather had navigated Tudor religious upheavals without committing fully to Protestant or Catholic. The family had perfected 4 centuries of strategic ambiguity. But 1645 was different. This war demanded certainty. Rainsborough was not interested in negotiation. He was interested in submission. The parliamentary demand was delivered on September 26th. Surrender Berkeley Castle immediately. Open the gates. Disarm the garrison. swear loyalty to Parliament, provide hostages as guarantee of future obedience. In exchange, the Berkeley family would retain their title and private lands. Refuse, and the castle would be reduced to rubble with the Berkeleys inside. George had approximately 60 soldiers in the garrison. Rainsborough had 1,200. George's walls were medieval stone, built to withstand arrows and siege towers, not modern artillery. Rainsborough's cannon could punch through 14-foot thick walls, given sufficient time and powder. The military calculation was obvious. Resistance meant death. Surrender meant survival with humiliation. George consulted his household. His wife argued for resistance. 400 years of Berkeley occupation could not end with a whimper. Better to die defending the castle than live as Parliament's servants. His son argued for pragmatism. Dead lords hold no land. Destroyed castles cannot be rebuilt. Surrender preserved the possibility of restoration. The debate lasted 3 hours. George chose survival. He always did. Every Berkeley for 4 centuries had chosen survival. On September 27th, George de Berkeley opened the gates. Parliamentary troops entered without resistance. They searched every room. They cataloged every weapon. They interrogated every servant. They found nothing treasonous because George had been careful never to commit treason explicitly. His neutrality had been genuine, if also strategically motivated. But genuine neutrality satisfied no one in civil war. Rainsborough needed an example. Berkeley Castle would provide it. The bombardment began on September 28th, despite the surrender. Rainsborough's justification was military necessity. Parliament could not leave a fortress this size intact behind their lines. The castle had to be rendered indefensible. The reality was political theater. Destroying Berkeley Castle demonstrated what happened to lords who tried to play both sides. The cannon fired for 3 days, 8 guns firing in rotation, targeting the keep and the outer walls. Medieval stone is remarkably resistant to cannon fire. Solid walls absorb impact. But sustained bombardment creates cumulative damage. Cracks appear, stones loosen, eventually sections collapse. By October 1st, a section of the keep's outer wall had breached. The Great Hall's roof had partially collapsed. The eastern tower showed significant structural damage. George watched from a guarded tent in the courtyard. He had surrendered. He had cooperated. His family had been declared Parliament's loyal servants. Yet Rainsborough was destroying his home anyway. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival required not just submission, but demonstrated loyalty. Ambiguity had consequences. The bombardment stopped on October 1st when powder supplies ran low. The castle was damaged, but standing. The keep remained habitable. The walls, though breached, could be repaired. Rainsborough had made his point. Berkeley Castle was no longer a fortress. It was a residence under parliamentary sufferance. Before departing, Rainsborough imposed terms. Berkeley Castle would be garrisoned by parliamentary troops for the duration of the war. George de Berkeley would pay for their provisioning. Any future royalist activity in Gloucestershire would be assumed to have Berkeley cooperation, resulting in immediate forfeiture. The family could stay, but they were now prisoners in their own castle, kept alive at the pleasure of the government that had bombarded them. George signed the agreement. He paid the first month's garrison expenses from family reserves. He watched Rainsborough's army march north toward the next royalist stronghold. And then he began the calculus every Berkeley had mastered: how to rebuild while appearing grateful for survival. The siege lasted 3 days. The psychological damage lasted decades. George had surrendered immediately, cooperated fully, and still watched his home get destroyed. The family's traditional strategy, neutrality, and flexibility had failed catastrophically. The Civil War represented a new political reality. Ideology mattered. Choosing sides mattered. Pragmatism alone could not guarantee survival when both sides viewed pragmatism as betrayal. George de Berkeley died in 1658, 3 years before the monarchy was restored. He never saw Berkeley Castle fully repaired. He never recovered the political influence his family had held before the war. His final years were spent managing debt and negotiating with parliamentary administrators who treated him with contempt disguised as legal formality. He had kept the castle. He had lost everything else. The siege that should have ended the Berkeley dynasty instead revealed its deepest flaw. For 400 years, the family had survived by never committing fully to any cause. But the world was changing. Wars were becoming ideological. Politics was becoming binary. There was no neutral ground left between armies that believed they fought for truth. The Berkeleys had to choose what kind of family they were, royalist or parliamentary, Catholic or Protestant, committed or opportunistic. Ambiguity was no longer a survival strategy. It was just slow-motion suicide. The cannon damage to Berkeley Castle took 80 years to fully repair. The damage to the family's strategy would never be repaired. They had learned too late that survival sometimes requires principles. But principles are expensive. The next 3 generations would discover exactly how expensive. Chapter 9: The Restoration That Demanded Everything. After the siege, Berkeley Castle was a ruin, and restoring it cost 3 generations everything they owned except the land. The damage from 1645 was extensive. The keep's eastern wall had a breach 15 feet wide. The Great Hall roof was collapsed across half its length. The outer curtain wall showed cracks in 3 sections. Windows were shattered. Doors were burned. Interior chambers had been looted by parliamentary troops looking for valuables. The castle that had stood intact for 500 years was, by 1650, a fortified wreck. George de Berkeley left his son, Charles, a castle that needed approximately £15,000 in repairs and an estate that generated £800 annually. The mathematics were brutal. Even dedicating every penny of revenue to reconstruction, full restoration would take nearly 20 years. But estates still required maintenance. Tenants still needed support. The family still needed to eat. In practice, restoration would take far longer. Charles de Berkeley, who inherited in 1658, attempted the impossible. He borrowed £3,000 against future estate revenues. He sold outlying manors his grandfather had acquired during the Wars of the Roses. He dismissed half the household staff. He mortgaged timber rights to pay for stone. Every financial maneuver generated a little more capital and a lot more debt. By 1660, he had rebuilt the keep's breach and re-roofed the Great Hall. He had also accumulated £7,000 in debt, more than 8 years' revenue. The work continued for decades. Charles spent his entire tenure as Lord, 33 years, managing construction and debt simultaneously. He rebuilt sections of wall. He restored chambers. He replaced windows. But each repair revealed more damage. Medieval construction uses techniques that require specialists. Finding craftsmen who understood vaulted ceilings and buttressed walls was expensive. Hiring them was more expensive. Charles paid because the alternative was abandoning Berkeley Castle entirely. That was unthinkable. 450 years of continuous Berkeley occupation could not end because of cannon fire and debt. The human cost exceeded the financial burden. Charles never married. He dedicated his life to the castle's restoration instead. His brother William married, but had no children. The family line narrowed dangerously. By 1690, when Charles died, the Berkeley barony passed to a distant cousin, James Berkeley, who inherited a partially restored castle, £11,000 in debt, and no clear plan for paying it. James sold everything not legally entailed to the title. He auctioned family heirlooms. He leased hunting rights. He cut timber faster than sustainable forestry allowed. He extracted every possible penny from the estate's resources. The work continued. By 1700, the castle was structurally sound, but the family was financially ruined. James died in 1710, owing £14,000 to various creditors. His estate managed by lawyers who took their fees from revenue before the family saw a shilling. Frederick Augustus Berkeley inherited in 1720. He was 23 years old. He had grown up watching his father strip the estate to pay debts incurred by his grandfather to repair damage from his great-grandfather's neutrality. The entire 18th century Berkeley experience was summarized in debt ledgers and mortgage agreements. Frederick understood immediately that conventional restoration was impossible. Revenue could not cover debt service and construction simultaneously. He needed a different strategy. That strategy was marriage. Frederick married Elizabeth Drax in 1722. Elizabeth was the daughter of a sugar plantation owner in Barbados. Her dowry was £20,000, the largest cash infusion Berkeley Castle had seen in 2 centuries. Frederick used $10,000 to pay off debts. He spent $8,000 completing the castle restoration. He invested the remaining $2,000 in agricultural improvements designed to increase estate revenue. The marriage worked financially. By 1730, Berkeley Castle was fully restored for the first time since 1645. The walls were intact. The keep was habitable. The Great Hall hosted events again. But the cost was comprehensive. Frederick had married for money, not love. His wife lived in London, preferring city society to Gloucestershire isolation. Frederick lived at Berkeley, managing the estate and the debts. They saw each other twice a year. They had one son, born in 1724. The marriage was functional, not affectionate, but it had saved the castle. The restoration changed what Berkeley Castle represented. Before the Civil War, it was a fortress held by a family. After the restoration, it was a Georgian country house, built inside medieval ruins, held by a family too poor to live elsewhere. The Berkeleys had transformed from medieval warlords into Georgian landlords. Their power came not from military strength, but from agricultural rents and careful estate management. The castle remained, but the family's relationship to it had fundamentally shifted. By 1755, when Frederick died, Berkeley Castle was restored, but the family was permanently changed. They were no longer warriors holding strategic territory. They were rent collectors living in a building too large for their diminished status. The Civil War siege had revealed a truth the family spent a century trying to deny. Medieval power structures were dead. Fortresses did not matter. Cannon made walls irrelevant. The future belonged to merchants, manufacturers, and plantation owners who built wealth through trade, not conquest. Frederick's son, Augustus Berkeley, inherited a restored castle and a profound identity crisis. What was the point of Berkeley Castle in the industrial age? Why maintain a medieval fortress when wars were fought with navies and colonies? The land generated revenue, but the castle itself was an expensive monument to obsolete power. Augustus spent his life maintaining the building out of dynastic obligation, not strategic necessity. He understood what his ancestors could not accept. They had won the battle to keep the castle, but lost the war for relevance. The family's finances stabilized in the late 1700s. Agricultural improvements and enclosure increased revenue. Careful management reduced debt. By 1800, the estate was profitable again for the first time in a century. But profitable meant generating enough income to maintain the castle and support the family. It did not mean wealthy. The Berkeleys were comfortable. They were no longer powerful. The restoration that cost 3 generations everything they owned had succeeded in its narrowest goal. Berkeley Castle stood intact, fully repaired, occupied by direct descendants of the Norman conquerors who built it. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The family had sacrificed marriage for money, sold their heritage to pay craftsmen, and transformed from aristocratic warlords into careful estate managers. They kept the castle by becoming something their ancestors would not have recognized: prudent. The siege that should have ended the Berkeley dynasty instead taught them the hardest lesson. Survival in the modern world required abandoning everything that had made survival possible for the previous 6 centuries. Flexibility, ruthlessness, and military power meant nothing against economic forces and social change. The Berkeleys could keep their castle only by accepting that the castle no longer mattered. They had restored a fortress in an age that no longer needed fortresses. The building survived. The purpose died. Chapter 10: The Aristocracy That Ate Itself. By 1870, the Berkeley title passed to a cousin who had never seen the castle, and absence became the family business. The direct male line ended with Frederick Augustus Berkeley, 5th Earl of Berkeley, who died in 1857 without legitimate heirs. The title and estates passed to his nephew, Craven Berkeley, who lived in London and showed no interest in Gloucestershire. Craven visited Berkeley Castle twice in his life. He found it gloomy, old-fashioned, and expensive to maintain. He preferred his townhouse in Mayfair. The castle became an administrative burden managed by a state. Agents who sent quarterly reports Craven rarely read. This detachment was not unique. The late 19th century aristocracy was hollowing out. Landed estates that had been family power bases for centuries became financial liabilities. Agricultural depression reduced rents. Death duties consumed capital. Maintaining medieval castles cost fortunes that industrial wealth and colonial investments could not offset. The smart strategy was selling the land and investing in railroads, shipping, or manufacturing. But selling meant abandoning 900 years of family history. Most aristocrats compromised. They kept the title, abandoned the castle, and let estate managers extract whatever value remained. Craven Berkeley died in 1881. His son, Randall Thomas Mowbray Berkeley, 8th Earl of Berkeley, continued the pattern. He lived in London. He attended Parliament sporadically. He visited Berkeley Castle for occasional shooting parties, but never resided there permanently. The castle became a hunting lodge used 3 weeks per year and maintained at great expense the other 49. The family's relationship to Berkeley Castle had become purely financial. The land generated rents that funded London lifestyles. The castle itself was a monument they paid to preserve, but no longer inhabited. Staff maintained empty rooms. Gardeners tended grounds the family rarely walked. The building existed in a strange limbo, occupied by servants, visited by owners, lived in by no one. World War I accelerated the collapse. Death duties introduced in 1910 taxed inherited estates at rates designed to break up landed wealth. When Randall Berkeley died in 1916, his son owed death duties exceeding £40,000. Paying required selling 6,000 acres, nearly half the estate's agricultural land. Berkeley Castle remained Berkeley property, but the economic foundation supporting it had been carved away. The ninth Earl, Randall Berkeley's son, lasted 12 years. He died in 1928, triggering another death duty assessment. His son, the 10th Earl, sold more land to pay. By 1930, the Berkeley estate consisted of the castle itself, the deer park immediately surrounding it, and approximately 2,000 acres, generating minimal income. The family had been reduced from medieval magnates controlling tens of thousands of acres to struggling landlords holding a single building they could not afford to abandon or maintain. The castle became unsustainable. Maintaining medieval architecture requires constant repairs. Stone walls need repointing, roofs leak, wood rots. Heating systems designed for open fires cannot warm 40-room castles efficiently. The costs mounted. The 10th Earl, facing bankruptcy, made the inevitable decision. In 1949, Berkeley Castle opened to public tours. The announcement framed it as civic generosity, allowing the public to experience historical heritage, educational opportunities for school children, preservation of national architectural treasures. The reality was simpler. The family needed money. Tourism generated revenue. Opening the castle to strangers was preferable to selling it to pay debts. The first public tour occurred in April 1949. Visitors paid 2 shillings to walk through the Great Hall, view the state rooms, and hear about Edward II's imprisonment. The family retained private apartments in the South Wing. Tourists were restricted to the Keep and the North Range. The division was symbolic. The Berkeleys lived in one section, while strangers paid to photograph the rest. The castle had become half home, half museum. The 9th Earl died in 1942. His son, the 10th Earl, died in 1969. The title passed to a cousin, then another cousin, fragmenting along genealogical branches so distant the title holders needed charts to explain their connection to the original Berkeley line. By 1980, the Earl of Berkeley was a man whose great-great-grandfather had been a distant cousin to someone who had actually lived at Berkeley Castle. The bloodline had become a technicality maintained through legal fiction. Yet the castle remained Berkeley property. Ownership laws protecting entailed estates meant the building could not be sold easily. It passed through inheritance structures designed in the 15th century to prevent estates from fragmenting. These laws, created to preserve aristocratic power, now trapped impoverished descendants in ownership of buildings they could not afford and could not abandon. The modern Berkeley family is not wealthy. They do not hold political power. They do not command armies or influence policy. They are, essentially, historical reenactors living in their ancestors' home, conducting tours for tourists who pay admission to see where a king died screaming 700 years ago. The aristocracy did not fall in a revolution. It ate itself through death duties, debt, and irrelevance. The Berkeleys survived by monetizing the very history that should have destroyed them. They turned the murder chamber into a tourist attraction. They made Edward II's ghost a commodity. They learned, as their ancestors always did, to survive by selling whatever survival required. Chapter 11. The Ghosts They Sell. Today, Berkeley Castle advertises Edward II's ghost as part of the admission price. monetizing the murder that should have destroyed them. The tour begins in the Great Hall. Guides explain the castle's history, 900 years of continuous family occupation, the longest such ownership in England. They mention the Norman conquest. They describe medieval banquets. They reference the Civil War siege. Then they walk visitors up the stone stairs to the keep and show them the chamber where Edward II was imprisoned. The room is small, perhaps 12 feet square. A single window overlooks the inner courtyard. The walls are stone, unadorned except for age. A placard explains that Edward spent 5 months here before his death in September 1327. It mentions the official cause, natural illness. Then it notes the persistent rumors, murder by suffocation or worse. It does not take a position. It presents both versions and invites visitors to decide. The guides tell the ghost stories, screams heard from empty rooms, a figure in royal robes seen at midnight, cold spots that appear without explanation, doors that close themselves. They frame these stories carefully. Some visitors have reported, local legend claims, whether one believes in ghosts or not. The phrasing maintains plausible deniability while encouraging supernatural speculation. Ghost tourism is profitable. Definitive skepticism would reduce ticket sales. The current residents, descendants of the original Berkeley line through increasingly distant genealogical connections, live in the South Wing. They maintain private apartments closed to tourists. They eat breakfast while strangers photograph the Great Hall. They sleep in bedrooms above the chamber where Edward died. They have learned to separate their home from the commodity they sell access to. The castle is both private residence and public attraction. The boundary is maintained through locked doors and tour schedules that end by 5 p.m. The family has embraced the murder legend they once denied. Gift shop merchandise includes books about Edward II's death. Postcards show the chamber where he was imprisoned. Evening ghost tours, offered October through December, cost £20 per person and fill weeks in advance. The tours emphasize supernatural elements. Guides lead groups through darkened rooms while recounting the poker legend in graphic detail. Visitors are encouraged to photograph orbs and cold spots. The entire experience is designed to entertain, not educate. This commodification is deliberate. Survival strategy. Berkeley Castle costs approximately £600,000 annually to maintain. Heating, staff, repairs, insurance, property taxes, all accumulate. Tourism generates roughly 70% of that revenue. Without public access, the castle would be financially unsustainable. The family would face the choice every impoverished aristocrat eventually faces: sell or surrender to the National Trust. Opening to tourists postpones that choice indefinitely. The irony is comprehensive. The Berkeleys survived Edward II's murder by denying involvement. They spent centuries minimizing the incident, paying for masses, claiming absence. Now they advertise the murder as their primary attraction. The crime scene their ancestors desperately tried to distance themselves from has become the reason tourists visit. The family's darkest moment has become their most valuable asset. The transformation reveals how thoroughly the relationship between aristocracy and history has changed. Medieval lords derived power from land and military strength. Modern aristocrats derive income from heritage and access. The Berkeley family no longer rules Gloucestershire. They curate it. They maintain a building and sell tickets to people interested in experiencing historical atmosphere. They have become service workers in their own ancestral home, performing aristocracy for audiences who pay for the performance. The current owner, Charles Berkeley, inherited in 2003. He was 42 years old. He had worked in finance in London. He had never expected to inherit the title or the castle. When the previous title holder died without closer heirs, Charles became the 25th Baron Berkeley through genealogical accident. He quit his job, moved to Gloucestershire, and learned the family business, maintaining a 900-year-old building while living inside it. Charles describes the experience as surreal. He sleeps in rooms where his ancestors slept, though those ancestors are separated from him by 20 generations and multiple collateral inheritance jumps. He manages staff who maintain the castle for tourists who photograph rooms he considers part of his home. He makes decisions about tour routes and gift shop inventory. He is simultaneously homeowner, business manager, and historical reenactor, playing the role of aristocrat. The castle has become a strange hybrid, part museum, part residence, part business, part burden. It generates enough revenue to maintain itself, but not enough to make the family wealthy. It employs 40 people between tour guides, ground staff, and administrators. It attracts 60,000 visitors annually. It serves as venue for weddings, corporate events, and historical reenactments. The building that began as a weapon of Norman occupation has become a venue for hire. Yet the family remains. Charles Berkeley lives at Berkeley Castle because inheritance law and family obligation make leaving unthinkable. He will pass the castle to his children, who will face the same choice: maintain the building or sell the past. So far, every generation has chosen maintenance. 900 years of continuous occupation suggests the pattern will continue. But continuation requires commodification. The ghosts must be sold. The murder must be advertised. History must become entertainment. The current marketing materials describe Berkeley Castle as a living monument to English history. They emphasize the unbroken family line, the medieval architecture, the connection to Edward II's mysterious death. They invite visitors to experience the past. What they are actually selling is access to a family's decision to survive by any means necessary, including transforming their ancestral crime scene into a tourist attraction. The Berkeleys have always done what survival required. In the 21st century, survival requires ghost tours and gift shops. Chapter 12. The Unbroken Grip. 900 years after the first Berkeley claimed this land, his descendants still sleep behind these walls, which makes them either remarkably fortunate or cursed beyond measure. The numbers are extraordinary: 30 generations, 9 centuries, 1 family, 1 building. From 1066 to 2026, the Berkeley bloodline has maintained continuous occupation of Berkeley Castle. This is the longest documented single-family residence in England, possibly in Europe. No revolution displaced them. No conquest expelled them. No bankruptcy forced a sale. They survived the Norman settlement, the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War, 2 world wars, death duties, agricultural depression, and the complete dissolution of the aristocratic system that created them. They are still here. But what does survival mean when everything around you has changed? The castle Roger de Berkeley built was a fortress designed to project military power across the Severn Valley. What Kinky Castle Charles Berkeley maintains is a tourist attraction designed to generate revenue through historical performance. The building is the same stones. The purpose is unrecognizable. The family changed to keep the castle. They bent their loyalty during the Wars of the Roses, switching sides 4 times to remain on whichever throne survived. They surrendered immediately during the Civil War siege, choosing humiliation over destruction. They married for money in the 18th century when debts exceeded revenues. They opened to tourism in the 20th century when maintaining private occupation became impossible. Every generation made the compromise required by their era. Flexibility was the only constant. This flexibility came at a cost measured in honor. The Berkeleys are not remembered for bravery. They are remembered for complicity in Edward II's murder and for surviving the accusation. They are known for switching sides, calculated absence during inconvenient moments, and prioritizing land over principle. Their family motto should be, "We endured because endurance, not virtue, is their legacy." The murder of Edward II defines them still. 700 years have passed. The truth of what happened in September 1327 remains unknowable. But the fact that it happened at Berkeley Castle, under Berkeley custody, possibly with Berkeley involvement, shapes how the family is perceived. They are the family in whose castle a king died. Everything else is footnote. This creates a strange inheritance for modern Berkeleys. They live inside their ancestors' crime scene. They monetize the murder for tourism revenue. They claim connection to a bloodline that reaches back to the Norman conquest, while acknowledging that connection is maintained through increasingly distant genealogical branches. They are custodians of a building that means everything and nothing simultaneously. It is historically significant. It is personally burdensome. It is financially necessary. It is morally complicated. The question is whether 900 years of continuous occupation represents success or failure. The Berkeleys kept their castle, but they lost their power. They maintained their title, but they abandoned their relevance. They preserved their bloodline, but they compromised their honor repeatedly to do so. What is victory when it requires becoming something your ancestors would despise? Medieval lords held land through military strength and ruthless efficiency. Modern Berkeleys hold land through inheritance law and tourism revenue. The first Roger de Berkeley would not recognize his descendants' lives. He seized land with a sword. They maintain it with gift shops. He built walls to keep enemies out. They opened doors to let strangers in. The continuity is architectural, not philosophical, yet there is something profound in their persistence. The Plantagenets fell. The Tudors died out. The Stuarts lost their throne. The British Empire collapsed. Berkeley Castle remains Berkeley property. The family outlasted dynasties by refusing to play their game. They were never important enough to destroy, never irrelevant enough to forget. They existed in the perfect middle zone of significance, too entrenched to eliminate, too flexible to oppose. This middle zone required sacrificing glory for survival. Great families are remembered for their triumphs or their dramatic falls. The Berkeleys are remembered for neither. They are remembered for endurance, for being still here when everyone else is gone, for holding the same stones their ancestors held when England was young, for demonstrating that survival is possible if you are willing to pay the price in dignity, honor, and transformation. The castle itself has become a physical manifestation of that price. Its walls still stand because 8 centuries of Berkeleys chose preservation over pride. Its chambers are open to tourists because modern Berkeleys chose revenue over privacy. Its history is sold to visitors because contemporary Berkeleys chose commodification over abandonment. Every compromise, every adaptation, every surrender of principle is embedded in the stones like fossils in limestone. 900 years is not luck. Luck does not last 3 decades, much less 30 generations. This is strategy. Brutal, effective, morally ambiguous strategy executed consistently across centuries. The Berkeleys understood what their more glorious peers did not. Holding the land was victory enough. How you held it, what you became to keep it, what you sacrificed to maintain it, those were acceptable costs. Legacy is not what you build. Legacy is what you refuse to lose. Berkeley Castle will outlast the current generation. It will pass to the next heir, whoever that is, through whatever genealogical path inheritance law determines. That heir will face the same choices every Berkeley has faced: maintain the building or sell the past. History suggests they will choose maintenance. They will compromise. They will adapt. They will do what survival requires, because that is what Berkeleys do. That is all they have ever done. The unbroken grip is not about strength. It is about refusing to let go, even when letting go would be easier, nobler, or saner. It is about holding land your grandfather never saw and your grandchildren will resent inheriting. It is about living inside a monument to your family's worst moment and selling tickets to people who want to see where it happened. It is about surviving when survival requires becoming unrecognizable. 900 years after Roger de Berkeley claimed this land with a sword, his descendants sleep in rooms where a king died screaming. They conduct tours through their ancestors' crime scene. They monetize murder legends their predecessors denied. They maintain walls built to project power they no longer possess. And they call this victory. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps survival, at any cost, is the only victory that matters. Or perhaps they are prisoners of their own inheritance, trapped in a building they cannot leave, guarding a legacy they cannot escape, demonstrating that the longest imprisonment is the one you inherit. The castle stands, the family endures, the grip remains unbroken. That is all. That is everything. That is what 900 years of compromise, complicity, and ruthless pragmatism builds. Continuity without glory, survival without honor, and stones that remember everything while forgiving nothing.